Lisa. And as Marty introduced to you, I'm a PhD student here as well, in the same cohort as Paul. And we share a lot of the same interests with respect to scholarly publishing, including open access. And Paul spoke briefly about open access in journals, but mainly about the history. Now, there's a lot of information out there about open access when it comes to journals. Not so much when it comes to textbooks, though. That's still fairly newish. And that's because, oops. All right. That's because there are some significant differences to take into consideration when we're comparing textbooks and journals with regards to open access and sort of the acceptance and growth of open access in that industry. So, for example, the type of content that's published in journals tends to be new research and original theory, whereas in textbooks, it's the fundamentals of the discipline. So from one textbook to the next could be, pretty much the same thing. The audience for journals is generally faculty, researchers, and grad students. And for textbooks, it's generally undergrads. So undergrads tend to be a little less worldly, I guess, unless they're mature, coming in as mature students. They tend not to know about how things work and what the alternatives are, and they'll just sort of go out and buy whatever is on the syllabus, right? And the primary incentive for authors who write for journals is recognition and academic credit. So they want their work to be read as widely as possible. So the idea of open access is it's very promising, and because it implies that there'll be wide distribution of their works. On the other hand, the primary incentive for textbooks is probably royalties. When it comes to getting tenure, writing textbooks is not really taken very strongly into consideration. It's more of like an extracurricular kind of thing. And when universities are being ranked by Maclean's and other organizations, textbook writing among their faculty is not very high on the list if it's considered at all. So these factors are going to have an effect on how widely open access is going to be accepted in academics. Okay, so you might think, okay, well, we've seen digital textbooks before. We have digital textbooks. We subscribe to them. You can access them through the library, or sometimes you could just buy one on your own. Well, open access textbooks are obviously digital textbooks by definition, but it's not quite the same as the e-textbooks or textbook rental that's provided by Amazon and publishing companies. So, for example, the e-textbooks and digital textbook may be open access, or they may be closer to traditionally published textbooks. So, for example, there may be limits on accessibility via the format. So, if you purchase or rent a book from Amazon, you can only read it on your Kindle, or perhaps from some other place you can read it on your browser, but you can't port it to other formats. So that might make things a little bit difficult. They're limited with respect to time, especially if you rent a textbook. You can access it for the semester, or you can access it for the year. As some of you know, even if you subscribe to digital textbooks, you have to keep paying for it every single year, or it'll just sort of expire, and they won't let you access it anymore. And also the number of users. As you know, if a library subscribes to a textbook, sometimes it can only be used by a certain number of people at one time. Sometimes it can't be accessible outside of the actual physical campus, and you can't proxy into it, for example. Anyway, there's a lot of limitations. And there's also limitations on use. So technical restrictions in the digital textbook might limit certain uses, such as printing. You can only print one chapter. You can only print 40 pages. Unless you log out and log back in again. There's restrictions on loaning. You can't let somebody else borrow it. You can't resell it, obviously. It's not a physical thing. These are things that an individual can easily and lawfully do with a physical textbook. And there might also be contractual restrictions against uses that might otherwise be permissible by copyright law. For example, fair dealing. Now these might be in the forms of a subscription agreement that is signed by the university or the library, or it might be a terms of use that supposedly binds you as soon as you open up the digital textbook and you're agreeing to these terms of use. And Professor Trosso is going to speak a little bit more about these limiting contractual terms. So I will just leave it at that. So meanwhile, open access. Well, there are fewer limits than with proprietary e-textbooks. None of the limits that I spoke of in the last slide apply to open access textbooks. Information can also be easily updated to reflect changes in the field. So in certain fields, such as medicine and law, things are happening all the time. New cases come out, new things are discovered, and they want to put in the textbook because it's now considered to be the fundamental part of that discipline. So open access information can be quickly updated as opposed to a physical book. Also, authors can easily collaborate, so they don't have to sort of go through the publisher. You can work together, especially if it's in like a wiki-type format or a modular-type format. Everyone can work together to produce one textbook. And similarly, instructors can mix and match resources freely. So a lot of instructors complain that the textbooks that they've chosen, it's I guess the best out of the lot, but there are still other things that I want to cover and it's not in it, so we'll have to supplement, for example, and they don't have to worry about, say, copyright infringement. If they're making copies for students, they don't have to send students on wild goose chase all over the internet to find this extra information. Now, from the point of view of the students, of which I am one and have been for a long time, so I can speak from experience, textbooks cost a lot of money. And the rate of inflation for textbooks is higher than the rate of general inflation has been for quite some time. So for example, in 2009, textbook costs rose 10 times the pace of general inflation. For textbooks, the rate of inflation was 3.5%, general inflation rate was 0.3%. And part of the reason for this is that the buyers, the audience for the textbooks, students are, as I said, they're not as worldly as those of us in this room here, but also they're captive buyers. They don't choose which textbooks they would prefer to buy. If they could, they would definitely take price into heavy consideration, because students generally are broke. But in fact, it's the faculty that choose the textbooks. And cost of textbooks is not really high on the list for faculty, for most faculty. For some, they do actually take that into consideration. But for most, they really don't. They want the best textbook, the most well-reviewed textbook, and the one that has the information that they want to teach. So students have to buy it. They don't really have a choice. I mean, you think, okay, maybe they can buy used books. Okay, but there are a couple of problems with that. For example, as I mentioned, in certain disciplines, things change really quickly. In law, for example, new cases come out and they need to be put in the textbook somehow, and you can't really do that without putting out a new, like an entirely new edition. So used textbooks are generally not very useful for that. I remember when I did my undergrad in psychology, and I remember I took a course on abnormal psychology, which was actually split over 2 semesters, with summer in the middle, and there was supposedly one textbook for both of the courses, for both semesters, which I thought, yes, bonus, I would like to buy one textbook. But meanwhile, in the meantime, they had updated the DSM, and during the time when I took the first course to the time I took the second course, there was a new edition of the textbook that was put out. So we ended up having to buy it. So I was not really thrilled with that, because these suckers were expensive. And publishers actually will put out new editions sometimes just for the purpose of cutting into the used textbook market. They really have no other reason to do so, except they don't want people to buy used textbooks, they want to buy new textbooks. And faculty who are considering, they don't have a lot of time, really. They're pretty busy, so they don't have time to go through and try to compare exactly what's different from each edition. So just be like, well, we'll have to get the new edition then. So again, going back to my undergrad days, and I'm sure anyone here who's taken university calculus in the past 25 years knows this book, the Stewart book, well, that sort of cello thing on the front of it. The first edition was published in 1987, and now they're up to the 7th edition, right? So it's like 7 editions in 25 years. That's one new edition about every 4 years, and like it's calculus, right? What changes, right? So you start to suspect, okay, well maybe the publishers or Professor Stewart himself are just trying to make a little more money. But I'm not saying that that's what Professor Stewart is doing, but probably that's what the publishers are doing. So again, like I said, the faculty, they don't necessarily check, and that's unfortunate. And there's also bundling of materials increases prices. So the textbook itself might come with a study guide, CD-ROM, a passcode for a digital version of it, which is, again, expires after the end of the year. So these may or may not be useful to the students. They never really tended to be for me, but they can double the price of the textbook, basically. And so, like in conclusion, undergraduates can pay up to $1,000 a year for traditionally published textbooks, and that price is just going to keep increasing. So, okay, what can we do? Well, what can the government do about it? Well, as Paul mentioned with regards to journals, there's no monitoring or regulation of textbook prices in Canada at all. So the Ontario government, what they've done is they have given out textbook tax credits of $65 a month for full-time students and $20 a month for part-time students, which is, I mean, nice, thanks, but it's not very useful until the student actually starts earning taxable income, or unless they pass the tax credit on to their parents, which I guess most would do. They used to have, Ontario used to offer a textbook grant of $150 that you would get if you qualified for OSAP, which leaves out a lot of students. And also, they discontinued it, so I'm useless now. Anyway. So, what this means is, if Ontario keeps giving out these tax credits, for example, and if they do bring back a sort of textbook grant, all this means is that as textbook prices rise, student aid will have to rise as well. And this means that taxpayers are subsidizing the profits of publishing companies. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't make me feel very comfortable. Meanwhile, British Columbia last year, they announced that they were going to partner with an organization called BC Campus to create open access textbooks for 40 first and second year university courses. So they're actually, instead of offering grants, tax credits, or whatever, which they may also do, but they're going to put in a big chunk of money every year to have these open textbooks created and distributed. And they did this. This link here is it's a link to the BC campus that has more information about the open textbook project. And the reason they did this said that they wanted to increase accessibility and affordability for post-secondary students. So thank you. And they have 3 titles so far since they announced in October 2012. I think one of them is project management, one is database management, and they're actually written by, 2 of them are written by a faculty member at a college in British Columbia, and another one is written by a sort of a consortium of colleges. So they're not just letting anyone write these textbooks, they're actually getting experts to do it. So, the upshot, conclusion, whatever you want to call it, well, there's 500,000 plus university students in Ontario, and that doesn't even include college students. And last year, the province said that they wanted to open up 60,000 more spots for post-secondary students. So, that's a lot of tax credits, that's a lot of grants, that's a lot of giving students back money for the exorbitant prices they pay because publishers keep wanting to make more money. Meanwhile, so these could add up to millions and millions of dollars per year. Meanwhile, British Columbia's Open Textbook Initiative is estimated to cost them between $600,000 and $1 million a year. So you can do the math. Meanwhile, it's also less costly to update new editions going forward. So we don't have to worry about students shelling out another $200 for a new edition when it can be updated for very, very little cost and distributed for nearly zero cost. But then quite apart from the economic concerns with open access textbooks, such a commitment as BC has made to its students, it shows that they support the use of technology in making information widely accessible rather than leaving in the control of commercial interests. Here within libraries, for example, you might be thinking, okay, well, what can we do? Well, Paul's presentation, actually, he had a chance to go through all his entire presentation. He does talk about the amount of money that could be saved by ceasing subscriptions to these proprietary journals and putting the money into sort of university or even library publishing initiative. So libraries themselves, university libraries, can also get involved in publishing both open access journals and open access textbooks that can then be used not just by the students that are in that university, but any of the students. So that's also something that you can keep in mind next time you go through the contracts and subscription contracts that you sign for all of these various materials. And I hope that you will also keep that in mind. And thank you very much for listening.